The diplomatic relationship between Canada and China appears to be on the mend after years of strain and a more recent escalation in trade tensions. But Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand was in Beijing this past week, where she held bilateral trade talks with her Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, with both Ottawa and Beijing agreeing to reopen communication lines, potentially paving the way for a summit between Mark Carney and Xi Jinping.
For nearly a decade, relations between Canada and China have been frozen in a deep diplomatic chill. Trade wars, detentions, human rights clashes, and a growing divide between East and West had turned once promising cooperation into quiet hostility. But something unexpected is happening behind the scenes. A series of secretive meetings, subtle diplomatic gestures, and cautious statements now suggest that the two countries, despite years of distrust, might be preparing for a dramatic reset. And if reports are correct, it could all lead to one event that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago: a summit between Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Chinese President Xi Jinping. This is the story of how Canada and China fell apart, why they're trying to mend their relationship now, and what this could mean for the global balance of power. For years, Canada-China relations have been defined by suspicion and anger. It began with a single diplomatic crisis: the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver in 2018 at the request of the U.S. government. Beijing responded with fury, detaining two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, in what many saw as hostage diplomacy. For over 1,000 days, the two men were held in Chinese prisons, becoming symbols of China's growing assertiveness and Canada's vulnerability. Even after their release in 2021, the damage was done. Canadian public opinion turned sharply against China. Polls showed that more than 80% of Canadians no longer trusted Beijing. Politicians across party lines began calling for stronger protections against Chinese interference, from trade to technology to national security. And while Canada continued to rely heavily on Chinese imports, the political relationship froze completely. Ottawa's approach shifted from cautious engagement to cautious distance. Diplomatic visits stopped. Joint trade projects collapsed. And in Beijing, China's wolf warrior diplomats treated Canada as a U.S. proxy, not as an independent player. For nearly 8 years, no Canadian foreign minister had set foot in Beijing. Until now. In mid-May 2025, Canada's new Foreign Affairs Minister, Anita Anand, quietly boarded a plane to Beijing. It was only the second Canadian ministerial visit in 8 years. The agenda was simple: trade talks, tariff disputes, and reopening lines of communication. But what the world saw as routine diplomacy was far more significant. Behind closed doors, Anand met Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, one of Beijing's most trusted and powerful figures. Both sides agreed to reopen communication lines, a diplomatic phrase that sounds harmless, but in truth, it signaled the beginning of something much bigger. A political thaw. The timing was no coincidence. China's economy was slowing. Its exports were under pressure from Western sanctions, and global demand was weakening. Meanwhile, Canada, stuck between U.S. protectionism and slowing domestic growth, needed new markets. Each side had something to gain, and both knew that politically it had to be done quietly. At the heart of the tension was one issue: tariffs. Canada had followed Washington's lead in imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles (EVs) and new restrictions on steel and aluminum. Beijing retaliated swiftly, slapping heavy tariffs on Canadian canola oil, pork, and seafood exports, targeting key agricultural sectors in Canada's prairie provinces. The result: a tit-for-tat trade war that hurt both economies but satisfied no one. Farmers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba began losing billions in export revenue. Auto manufacturers in Ontario faced shortages of cheap components from China. And Canadian consumers started paying more for vehicles, electronics, and industrial materials. Meanwhile, Beijing's retaliation sent a clear message. If Canada wanted access to China's 1.4 billion consumers, it needed to back off the US-led economic war. But politics complicated everything. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford and other provincial leaders strongly opposed lifting tariffs on Chinese EVs, arguing that it would crush domestic car production. Yet for Ottawa, the numbers were undeniable. Continued confrontation meant lost trade, lost jobs, and lost influence. So when talks began in Beijing, whispers quickly spread through diplomatic circles: a deal might be coming. If Mark Carney, Canada's recently elected Prime Minister, moves forward with a summit with Xi Jinping, it will be a political gamble unlike any other. Carney, a former central banker with deep ties to global finance, represents a pragmatic wing of Canadian politics, one that prioritizes economic security over ideology. To many in Ottawa, the idea of shaking hands with Xi Jinping is political suicide. Human rights advocates, opposition MPs, and even some within Carney's own cabinet warn that any attempt to normalize relations with China could be seen as a betrayal of Canadian values. But Carney's inner circle sees it differently. With the U.S. under a new Trump administration and global trade shifting rapidly toward Asia, Ottawa believes it cannot afford isolation. Canada's economy, heavily dependent on exports, needs diversification. And while the U.S. remains its largest partner, China's market remains irresistible. A Carney-Xi summit, therefore, isn't just about trade. It's about repositioning Canada on the world stage, showing that it can act independently of Washington while still defending Western values. Still, the optics will be delicate. To succeed, Carney must convince Canadians that engaging with China doesn't mean surrendering principles, and that diplomacy is not endorsement. From Beijing's perspective, the timing couldn't be better. China's once booming economy has slowed dramatically. Youth unemployment is rising, property markets are unstable, and Western sanctions have pushed its tech giants from Huawei to BYD into crisis mode. Xi Jinping's administration knows that diplomacy with middle powers like Canada could soften China's global image and counterbalance U.S. pressure. Over the past year, Beijing has been toning down its wolf warrior diplomacy, signaling a shift from confrontation to cooperation. The message is clear: China wants to rebuild bridges, but on its own terms. For China, warming ties with Canada could achieve three things: access to critical resources from Canadian minerals to agricultural imports, a friendly Western partner to ease its diplomatic isolation, a wedge in the U.S.-led alliance, proving that not all Western countries are united against Beijing. That's why when Annan's plane landed in Beijing, Chinese state media quickly began emphasizing partnership, dialogue, and mutual respect. For a country that once blasted Canada as a puppet of Washington, this was a striking shift in tone. Yet beneath the smiles and photo ops lies an uncomfortable truth. The two countries remain deeply divided on values. Canada continues to criticize China over its treatment of Uyghurs, its crackdown on Hong Kong's democracy movement, and its history of arbitrary detentions. Xi Jinping's government, in turn, accuses Canada of interference and hypocrisy. When asked whether Carney might set aside human rights concerns for trade gains, experts were clear that's unlikely. Instead, Canada's new strategy is to separate the two issues. Engage China on trade, but push for human rights reform through coalitions with like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific: Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India. As one professor put it, we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. In other words, Canada wants to pursue trade without compromising its values, an idealistic vision that's easier said than done. At the heart of Canada's renewed engagement is its Indo-Pacific strategy, a plan to strengthen its presence in Asia without directly confronting China. This means deeper partnerships with Southeast Asian economies, investments in digital trade, and new security dialogues. But experts believe China must be part of that strategy, not excluded from it. A future Carney-Xi summit could serve as the opening act for that larger vision, a balanced foreign policy that allows Canada to remain both a Western ally and a Pacific power. Yet that path is narrow. Too much alignment with China risks angering Washington, too little engagement, and Canada risks isolation in the world's fastest-growing region. It's a diplomatic tightrope, and every step will be watched closely. As talks progress, expectations are rising that a Carney-Xi summit could happen sooner rather than later. While no official announcement has been made, diplomats in Ottawa and Beijing are already preparing potential talking points: tariffs, EV trade, canola oil exports, and broader cooperation on climate and finance. But beyond the formal agenda, the meeting would symbolize something deeper: the reawakening of a relationship once thought beyond repair. For Canada, it's a test of maturity to act as a sovereign nation with its own foreign policy priorities. For China, it's a chance to prove that it can still attract Western partners despite global suspicion. And for the rest of the world, it's a reminder that geopolitics is never static. Even the deepest divides can shift when interests align. The story of Canada and China's relationship is one of contradictions: distrust and opportunity, morality and pragmatism, distance and dependence. But as global power continues to shift eastward, both nations know that isolation serves no one. If Carney and Xi do meet, it won't be a handshake of friendship, it'll be a handshake of necessity. Because in the end, every nation must choose between standing still in ideology or moving forward in reality. And for Canada and China, after years of silence, that movement has finally begun.